This is a review article by Barry Finger. Um, the article is called "The Israel Question and the Left: A Review Essay." I'm reading this in part because I've been uploading the essays, video audiobooks of the essays from the Jean Améry book titled "Essays on Anti-Semitism, Anti-Zionism, and the Left" onto this YouTube channel. Um, And so this is a review of it, and it's also a review of the book Confronting Anti-Semitism on the Left, Arguments for Socialists by David Randall. I think it's David. Anyway, we'll see. Daniel Randall. Sorry, Daniel Randall. I'll just read the little introduction they have here anyway. Why am I giving my own introduction? I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. Okay. So, Barry Finger is a frequent contributor to U.S. socialist journals, a former shop steward and activist with the Public Employees Federation. In this review essay, he urges the left to face up to the reality of left anti-Semitism and to consider the radical democratic alternative offered in the writings of Jean Améry and Daniel Randall. It's got some quotes in the beginning. Quote, "Strike the Zionists dead, turn the Middle East red." German New Left slogan of the 1970s. Quote, "Y'all love to add the word liberal in front of the most evil things, and it's unhinged DDDDD. WTF is a liberal Zionist. What's next? Liberal Nazi? Liberal colonizer? Liberal murderer? Liberal imperialist? Liberal fascist?" End quote. From the world of Twitter. Quote, "Whoever attacks, quote, Zionists, but under no circumstances means to say anything against the, quote, Jews, is deceiving himself or others. The state of Israel is a Jewish state. Whoever wishes to destroy Israel, overtly or by means of policies that can effect nothing but such a destruction, is pursuing the hatred of Jews of former times, and as it always was." End quote. Hans Meyer. Hans Meyer is the birth name of Jean Améry. He's from Austria, but he moved to France and changed his name to Jean Améry due to his desire to separate entirely from the state of the perpetrators. All right, now we're finally getting to the review. Okay. I review books by two noteworthy socialist thinkers here, both of whom grapple in their own way with Mayer's conclusion. The work of one, a product of mature reflection, written by a noted resistance fighter, concentration camp survivor, and renowned Jewish philosopher, raging incandescently against a left that turned on the Jews, the other by a young trade union militant who dissects anti-Semitism on the left, and with a steely detachment and the calm eviscerating deliberation of a legal scholar. Jean Améry, a comrade and accolade of Sartre, was a proud and proudly defiant left-wing atheist Zionist. Daniel Randall, influenced by the Marxist academic Moïse Pistone, by his movement comrade Robert Fine, and by the late libertarian socialist Steve Cohen, author of the freshly reissued "That's Funny, You Don't Look Anti-Semitic," is a self-identified heterodox Trotskyist internationalist and, quote, anti-Zionist Zionist, end quote. If Israel, in the abstract, was central to Améry's Jewish identity, Randall is, in Isaac Deutscher's term, a non-Jewish Jew, rooted in Jewish awareness, yet politically suspicious of the excesses and crimes to which nationalism, including the nationalism of the oppressed, alternately Jewish and Arab/Palestinian, often gives license. I think Randall might be Jewish, or have have some Jewish background, but I don't think that's like important for his analysis at all, really. I think it's just a fact that he kind of, in the interviews I've seen with Daniel Randall, he say that as like, oh yeah, this happens to be true, but it's not really important here. Although written decades apart, Améry's collection, an occasionally repetitious yet always penetrating presentation without a central organizing structure, and Randall's tightly systematized historical focus, ultimately align this. Modern left-wing anti-Semitism, resurrecting primitive tropes from previous waves of Jew hatred, is now inescapably intertwined with the Israel-Palestine conflict. Although Améry assumes a more partisan stance, neither author is blind to the injustices historically borne by both sides. Améry, however, is the more pessimistic of the two, at once horrified and resigned to a state of permanent exile beyond the orbit of the organized left, a left unable to free itself from habitual myths and incendiary vocabulary, mechanical yea-saying, and unconditional support for Palestinian irredentism that constitutes the only acceptable expression of Palestinian solidarity. Nevertheless, both authors are united in their belief in a two-state solution, in their belief that a two-state solution is the only viable, even unavoidable next step in Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation. Randall believes that significant elements of the mass left trade unions, social democratic and socialist parties, anti-war organizations, and human rights movements are still salvageable for the purpose through theoretical education, reinforced and amplified by the concrete... One second. Got a file to save. Randall believes that significant elements of the mass left trade unions, social democratic and socialist parties, anti-war organizations, and human rights movements are still salvageable for that purpose through theoretical education, reinforced and amplified by the concrete opportunities afforded through joint Israeli-Palestinian struggle and wider movement building in support of such struggles. It is largely by embracing this perspective that socialists can address the collective grievances and well-justified fears of the two victimized and vulnerable peoples without succumbing to the one-sided poisons of nationalism. His aim is a politics that levels up rights and freedoms without upending and reversing the axis of oppression. This sets the framework for his orientation towards anti-Semitism in the British Labour Party. An emphasis on discussion and an enlightened return to internationalist first principles through comradely persuasion rather than wielding as an initial response the heavy hammer of expulsion for intemperate outbursts of Jew hatred. Neither author could survey the socialism of their day and find it anything other than wanting. Socialism has, as in so many instances when called upon, not only failed but also betrayed the elementary demands of internationalism. It would belabor the issue to rehearse the sorry litany. Randall argues that the enduring, not in his words, appeal of anti-Semitism, Randall argues that the enduring, bracket, not his words, end bracket, appeal of anti-Semitism for elements of the left resides in its seemingly anti-hegemonic orientation. By claiming to punch up against the well-positioned Jews or, quote, Zionists, it insinuates itself as a legitimate current of an organizing worldview of the powerless against global forms of domination, capitalism and capitalist imperialism, a current, however errant, that nevertheless can feed into socialism. This, for example, was behind the early opportunistic German Social Democrats' ambivalence towards anti-Semitism, placating anti-Semitism when it leaned against capitalism, while warning against the dangers of, quote, philo-Semitism, lest it prematurely disrupt the evolving allegiances of primitive militants who were assumed to be on the march towards socialism. All of this brings us full circle. Too much has been made of the quote Jewish question as a minority problem. It is more properly a problem of majority attitudes, and this includes the prevailing attitudes of socialist movements confronted with such convictions from below. Socialists are challenged by the task of engaging the masses where they, quote, are, politically, of encouraging the spirit of combativeness while challenging them to jettison atavistic beliefs. Yet it has often been the case that that minorities who are oppressed and who are vulnerable to oppression are not necessarily the most disadvantaged. And this is a problem the left finds difficult to recognize, much less handle. This vulnerability was true not only of the Jews of Eastern Central Europe and parts of the Ottoman Empire, where Greek and Armenian communities likewise periodically prospered, but also of the Chinese of Indonesia and the Tamils of Sri Lanka, to name but two. It is no less true of American, British, and French Jewry today. A glaring democratic deficit adheres to socialist movements that fail to assert the right to minority identity, to cultural expression, and to religious exercise based on economic privileges that such minority communities allegedly enjoy. At their worst, Marxian socialists in the past were negligent in shaking off anti-Semitism for fear of damming a stream that feeds into the larger flow of social insurgency. The problem is that the radical left is now actively complicit in propagating it. The quote Jewish question, end quote, of yesterday is the quote Israel question, end quote, of today. And there is no way of reading Randall or Améry otherwise. In either case, what we are dealing with here is not the anti-Semitism residing in the personal prejudices of the individual mind, though it may well coexist with them. It is rather a broad political cultural formation having a dominant ideological presence, a complex internal logic, and a respected, promiscuously self-referential arsenal of totemic literature. These give left-wing anti-Semitism the power to transmit itself to new future believers through the standard process of gradual familiarity leading to eventual conversion. And insofar as the belief that Zionism, as a driver and principal beneficiary of, quote, racialized capitalism, end quote, is an integral part of the political complex of recruitment to contemporary socialism, it presents formidable obstacles to those on the left who seek to resist its blandishments. Améry and Randall trace this back to the baneful shadow that Stalinist imperialism cast over the broader left as it inserted itself into the Arab-Israeli conflict. Stalinism was no stranger to anti-Semitism. It eagerly exploited Russian and Eastern traditions of anti-Semitism and consolidated its own virulently nationalist rule by purging its ranks of untrustworthy, quote, cosmopolitan elements, i.e. Jews, often loyally pro-Stalinist Jews. The Russian ruling class kept the spigot of anti-Semitism always well lubricated. It could shut down when the ruling bureaucracy used the Jewish plight to recruit Western allies in the war against Hitler, or when it saw strategic regional advantage in Israel driving out British imperialism. But the spigot was opened wide again when the post-war Arab reawakening was ascendant. In this regard, Stalinism was uniquely equipped to meet the Arab nationalist drive to diminish Western influence by exploiting their ideological commonality. Anti-Semitism cemented Stalinism's bona fides with the rising secular nationalist forces in the Middle East, unshakable in the conviction that the road to Arab unity ran through Jerusalem. For most forms of past Jew hatred, short of Nazism, made a distinction between good and bad Jews, or bad Jews and salvageable Jews, or Jews who either reject their Jewishness and join the camp of the good, or who advantaged that camp by revealing the secret iniquities and perfidy of the, quote, Jewish people, end quote. Stalinist anti-Semitism introduced a separation between the blameless, obsequious Jews and the evil, tentacle-grasping Zionists, and with an unctuous bat of the eye, coyly insisted to the world that by this distinction alone they had vaccinated themselves against the charge of anti-Semitism. It was all about the hatred of power-grabbing ideology, not of a people. And in any case, their anti-Zionism still offered an escape valve to, quote, socialist, redemption for those Jews who wished to defect to the, quote, Arab Revolution against imperialism, end quote, and advantage the power politics of Stalinist expansion. There have also arisen independent strains of anti-Zionist Jewish leftism, self-proclaimed defectors to the cause of the good by those who invoke the noble tradition of the Jewish Labor Bund to justify their support for BDS and Israel eliminationism. Nevertheless, these appeals are superficial and ironically tone-deaf. The Bundist program arose out of the specific environment that prevailed in the Pale of Settlement. None of today's putative Bundists raised the obviously absurd demand for Jewish communities to reconstitute themselves as culturally autonomous, Yiddish-speaking national minority enclaves within the nations they inhabit. Yet what is utterly lost to these would-be adherents of Bundism is the historic paradox that post-Holocaust diasporic Jewry identifies as, quote, Zionist, yet often function as, quote, Bundists. In practice, they reject the, quote, ingathering of the exiles, end quote, but remain sensitive to threats menacing any Jewish community, including the majority Jewish state, to exist unmolested wherever it is rooted. And while they do not share the optimism of early Zionism that, quote, normalization of Jewish existence through the creation of a national home would attenuate anti-Semitism, they nevertheless defend the right of the Jewish community of Israel to assert its communal identity nationally in the freely chosen form of a state. The ties that bind diasporic Jews to Israel are, in other words, the same that tie it, and have historically tied it, to one another through time. That these loyalties are now disparaged as, quote, Zionist, is both unduly flattering to Zionism and ahistoric. But the disparagement of those loyalties is also revealing. It reveals a suspicion of intracommunal Jewish loyalties and of secret political motives. The building blocks of Randall's primitive anti-Semitism, camouflaging itself as anti-Zionism, for all formulations of the, quote, Jewish question, now posed as the, quote, Israel question, still revert back to the harm Jewish loyalties purportedly inflict on humanity and the need to locate and eliminate those harms by addressing the concentrated sources of Jewish power. Between retreat to the ghetto and total assimilation into the nationalism of the host countries, a broad and fluid range of cross-fertilizing ideologies arose within pre-Holocaust Jewish communities. Synthesizing competing and overlapping movements, they grappled with the problems of communal self-preservation in the spirit of modernity. The various factions, Yiddishists, Hebraicists, autonomists, Zionists, socialists, or Bundists, cultural and religious reformists, all advanced strategies to navigate the dissonance between universalism and particularism. So too emerged the broader trends of socialism with which Améry and Randall identify. These variants of socialism posit capitalist exploitation as the constituent agent through which other secondary forms of domination and oppression, national, racial, gender, ethnic, etc., are sustained. Broadly speaking, because workers are exploited collectively but oppressed in specific and diverse ways, which they experience in common with non-exploited subaltern and vulnerable populations, any successful struggle for working class liberation necessarily awakens the need to address and encompass the widest spectrum of social grievances. This socialism perceived itself as a broad social movement for freedom and equality driven to challenge capitalism by its working class core. Without that core, such struggles would expand the democratic plurality of civil society, but leave the sustaining structures of exploitation unmolested. It was this understanding, no doubt, that once attracted masses of Jews, and not just working class Jews, to socialism. The quote, old socialism understood formal legal and political equality attained under some evolved forms of capitalism to be true democratic advances, extracted at great working class costs, whose fullest expression awaits the abolition of classes. The contemporary left, in stark contrast, is postmodern. And that is also why Améry and Randall's work will sadly appeal to a different and diminished order of humanity. Those who still adhere to the Enlightenment values from which the left emerged. Postmodern socialism, the socialism that grew out of the new left's third worldism, Maoism, and Orientalism in reverse, no longer locates power discrepancies primarily in class inequalities and the ramifying limitations those deficiencies impose on democracy. It is categorically suspicious of democracy and universal rights, seeing them as ideological fog that obscures the true sources of inequality, the global defense of racial privilege. It replaces exploitation as the central dynamic of capitalism with imperialist wealth redistribution from global south to north, from people of color to broadly defined white elites, and sees this dynamic recapitulated in the internal structures, the race relations of the capitalist metropoles. At its extreme, it writes off the socialist potential of white workers for being junior partners of capitalism in the global structures of imperialism. At a minimum, it refuses, for parallel reasons, to quote privilege class over race. It repurposes the language of the old socialism with discussions of quote racialized capitalism and quote racial exploitation, and considers reactionary third world movements and even authoritarian, intolerant religious ideologies that threaten to disrupt the imperialist nexus as now quote objectively end quote progressive. The quote new socialism predictably understands the national conflict between Israel and Palestine over contested territory as a racial conflict, not a contest of competing chauvinisms. All the old internationalist values that Randall and Améry champion are irrelevant to it. For the quote new end quote socialism, Israeli Jews are not a nation but rather an entrenched white settler colonialist community. Israeli democracy, including hard-fought LGBTQ plus gains, is not a conquest of human rights, but exculpatory eyewash for apartheid. Diasporic Jews who challenge this perspective are written off as apologists for white privilege and are cast out on that basis from progressive movements, demonstrations, and struggles. Special, nominally Jewish, leftist organs prominently function to certify the anti-imperialist, anti-racist credentials of Jews who wish entry. A settler community in the single Palestinian state of the future will be denied equal democratic rights with other Palestinians. The Israel eliminationist left is quite clear on this issue. That is, Israeli Jews in any unified single state will be denied the basic democratic right of being considered a nation. They may, it is claimed, enjoy religious freedom and some rights to cultural expression, but they will not have the right to self-determination. There is not even a trace of binationalism, which at least gestures to traditional democratic principles in all this. What is being proposed for Israeli Jews is akin to the dubious equality enjoyed by Ukrainians within Tsarist Russia. All common rights save the right of being a Ukrainian. Améry and Randall offer radical democratic alternatives. Is there an audience for this? Well, I hope there's an audience for this because I read the goddamn books. Except I will say that anything that I post that relates to Jews or anti-Semitism or Israel always gets a mysterious downliking in a way that other videos that I share about Marx or the labor movement do not. So there's definitely some people who would hate what Améry and Randall have to offer, who even might in other cases might for other reasons subscribe to this channel. So let's hope it can have some influence here, at least get some people to think about this whole situation from a rational perspective